from day one when I walked off the plane and just saw the people, smelt the air, smelt what was in the air there, smelt the country, just what I just knew that it was different.
When the Vietnam War ended and our veterans came home to America, some of them swore they'd never return to Vietnam. For some, the pain was just too much. For others, they got out alive and they wouldn't be caught dead back in Vietnam. But a few of these veterans soon started experiencing a growing desire to go back. At first, it was just a thought that grew into a calling. They had unfinished business in Vietnam. They felt their story there was not yet complete. They wanted desperately to write another chapter, to do something to help the people in the land in which they fought. Welcome to the By War and By God podcast. I'm your host, Kent Williamson. This show is a companion series to the award-winning documentary film By War and By God. It's a place where we can go deeper into the stories of the lives of these veterans than we're able to in the film. This season, we've been telling the remarkable accounts of people whose lives were forever changed by the Vietnam War. You've heard stories of heroism and stories of tragedy, but you'll also hear some amazing stories of reconciliation. And you'll learn about a magnetic force that tugged and pulled and eventually drew these soldiers, medics, machine gunners, and crewmen back to Vietnam for the purpose of serving some of the poorest of the poor in that beautiful country. But before we get into the show, I need to tell you about Big Heaven Cafe. Big Heaven Cafe is the place to go to purchase the documentary By War and By God and a few other films. So if you need a copy, please click your way to bigheavencafe.com. That's bigheavencafe.com and use the coupon code PODCAST to save some money on the film. How much money? 113,850 Vietnamese dong, or $5 US. And don't forget that 20% of all sales of By War and By God from Big Heaven Cafe go to Vets with a Mission, the nonprofit that since 1989 has taken nearly 1,400 Vietnam veterans back to Vietnam. Why do they go back? For healing and reconciliation, and all the cool work you'll be hearing about over the next few shows. In today's episode, we're going back to Vietnam. Let's jump right in. What made you decide that you wanted to go back?
Well, I think like many Vietnam vets,
This is Phil Carney.
after the war, I did the typical thing, kind of spent a decade self-medicating and had a lot of issues, but I always had it in my heart. I just always felt like I left Vietnam with unresolved issues. And it was always kind of an unspoken desire and dream, especially after I became a Christian. Wouldn't it just be great to go back and do something? And I had no idea what that meant. And of course, in that era of time, it was not a possibility. It wasn't even a reasonable, rational thought. Nobody went back to Vietnam. But I had it in my heart. And so when this missionary approached me in a church service and made known to me there was an organization that was being developed called Vets with a Mission, and they were going to be able to possibly actually go back to Vietnam and take some vets back to Vietnam and just see what they could do, it just so matched what was in my heart. And so I was just all in.
My reaction to it all was both a very natural physical draw, but yet at the same time, I knew and understood that my faith was involved in it.
This is Bob Paragallo.
My faith could not sit on a church step, that my faith could not just be an inactive component of who I was. I believe decisions were made beyond myself that opened up opportunities for me to actively participate in returning to Vietnam, first out of curiosity, and that curiosity develops into purpose. And the first trip back was in 1988, and then the second trip was in January 1989. And from those two trips, we felt that we needed to organize this and become a humanitarian organization in Vietnam. And Vets with a Mission took off from then and has been going up until today.
When did you first learn about Vets with a Mission? But first, did you serve in Vietnam? Would you ever consider going back? I'd like to know, so please tell me why you would or why you wouldn't. Record your response on your phone and email it to me. Or if you prefer typing, go for it. You can send it to me at kent@bywarandbygod.com. That's Kent, K-E-N-T, at bywarandbygod.com. I'll look forward to hearing why you would or wouldn't go back to Vietnam. And we might put some of your stories into a future episode. Now, back to the show. When did you first learn about Vets with a Mission? This is Roger Helly.
I first learned about Vets with a Mission in 1988. I was invited to go to Focus on the Family in California, Dr. James Dobson. And when we were there, we were going to tape a series of 3 programs dealing with how Vietnam affected people and then how that affected the family. And there were 3 veterans on the panel, myself and another gentleman and Bill Kimball. And Dr. Dobson always takes people into a room and talks to them, before he interviews them. And so he said to Bill, Bill, I understand you just come back from a fact-finding trip to Vietnam. And he said, yeah, and that was it. We went on and talked about other things. So afterwards, I said to Bill and his wife Rose, I said, can we take you guys out to dinner? And I want to hear more about, what you did. And so that's how I got introduced to Vets with a Mission, and that was in August 1988. In January, I was making my first trip, and what I thought at that time my only trip back to Vietnam.
And how many times have you been back since?
I've made 17 trips back to Vietnam since I first went with Vets with a Mission in January of 1989.
In 1991, I'd gone to a conference for Vietnam vets.
This is Chuck Ward.
I was at a message board. I'd left my business card there because I've had this yearning to go back to Vietnam, didn't know how to do it. And so I put a little note on the message board for all the veterans at the conference with my business card. And it just simply said, interested in going back to Vietnam to do something good. Call me. And all my business cards were gone in 2 or 3 days, but no one ever called me. And so I went one more time before leaving the conference to check that message board. There was no messages, but this really tall guy was there, and it was Roger Helly. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he said, well, I just came back from Vietnam 2 weeks ago. And that's how I met Vets with a Mission.
The first trip we made back to Vietnam in January of 1989, there were 10 of us.
Again, Roger Helly.
It was kind of an interesting trip because the plane, they had us flying around in circles because they wouldn't turn the runway lights on. For some reason, for security purposes, and so they had the plane land at the end of the runway, and a truckload of soldiers armed with AK-47s came and walked through the plane upon landing before we were allowed to deplane, just to let us know that we were not in Kansas anymore.
This is Bob Paragallo.
Back in those days, everything in Vietnam was minimal. Everybody was on the verge of disaster. Everything was run down. The state of everything was just horrible.
I was on the second trip that Vets with a Mission took back to Vietnam.
This is Phil Carney.
There were 2 trips in '89. I was on the second trip late in the year. It was surreal. We couldn't get visas from the United States. Nobody was going to Vietnam. We couldn't get visas. So we actually got our visas through Mexico. And we flew on Air France. It was the only airline that would fly or that did fly into Vietnam. It was the only airline that flew. I remember landing at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon. And all of the old hangars were still there from the war, but there was no airport. When we got off of the plane, there was a metal hut sitting at the end of the runway that had an electrical cord hanging from the ceiling and a light bulb. And there was a Vietnamese soldier sitting in that with an AK-47. And he had no idea what to do with us. We showed him our passports and he didn't know what to do with them. There was no stamp. There was nobody, especially Americans, coming to Vietnam. And so it was just strange. The most overwhelming, or not overwhelming, but just strange was how quiet it was. And how minimal the activity was. The air base, there was nobody there. There were no people there. And driving into Saigon, there were no cars. There were just a few people on bicycles. You could literally walk for blocks and just see a few people. There was nothing in the stores. It was the country was absolutely devastated, and there was just nothing there. I remember nobody believed that we were Americans. They thought we were Russian. And when we would show them our passport and explain to them and convince them that we were from America, the reception was just overwhelming. And they were so excited to see Americans. And so those are some of the standouts that I remember initially, how quiet it was. There was no air traffic compared to the war. You know, there were planes and helicopters flying nonstop. There were people everywhere. It was noisy. It was loud. There was stuff going on. And it was so quiet and so few people out on the streets.
The feelings I had going back to Vietnam ran a whole gamut.
This is Cal Dunham.
When I got off the airplane, there were the military standing there with machine guns, rifles, and they were watching you as you got off the plane, processed through. And I must admit, I remember quite vividly when I stepped through, there were 3 guys standing there, 3 Vietnamese Army guys standing there just giving me the look. And I looked at them and I quite frankly thought, I don't know if we won or lost, but I could still kick your keister back to Hanoi. And I had to say to myself, Lord, this cannot be how I'm going to spend this summer in Vietnam. I've got to have something happen to me that's going to change me so I don't have those kind of feelings of hostility. The first nights were very difficult because I could hear people outside my room talking in Vietnamese, and it would bring back the memories that I remember laying out in the jungle in ambush in the middle of the night, hearing Vietnamese voices out in the jungle. I saw real quickly that many of them were already past the war. I hadn't progressed from it, but they had.
Let's talk about going back. What was it like to return with Vets with a Mission? But first, we're giving away the soundtrack to the film By War and By God. So if you like the music you're hearing, go to bywarandbygod.com, click on the soundtrack item on the menu, and download all 8 tracks of Will Musser's great score. It's free. I also want to say thank you for listening, and I want to ask you to please tell a friend about us. Think about that person. Who is it that needs to hear this podcast? Would you do me a favor and tell them? Thank you. And one more ask. Would you please go to iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review? Your words will help others know that this show is worth listening to. All right, let's get back to this episode. Let's talk about going back. What was it like to return with Vets with a Mission?
I had no idea what to expect when we went back.
This is Pat Cameron.
I think I was excited. I think maybe I thought it was a calling from my Lord and Savior. I didn't know really what to expect. From day one, when I walked off the plane and just saw the people, smelt the air, smelt what was in the air there, smelt the country, just what I just knew that it was different. I knew it was communist. I could just see I could tell by the guards and by the guys carrying the guns at the airport, and by the way they were controlling things, that it wasn't like any other country that I had gone in with a visa. I just and then as we got settled in, I'm a pretty adventurous person, and I went out on the streets and walked. I got the feeling that I felt comfortable. I didn't feel like there was any anger. I felt like it was kind of safe. Didn't feel any of that when I was 19. promise you.
It was the summer of '92 when I made my first trip with Vets with a Mission to go back to Vietnam, and it was not that big of a deal.
This is Chuck Ward.
I didn't have any, quote, issues when I went back that time with Vets with a Mission. It was really a great trip, and just a great trip. A lot of evidence of the war still, a lot of tanks and armored personnel carriers and helicopters and things like that all over the place. Lots of ordnance, many craters. I mean, you could tell there was a war, even though it was a little over 15 years since it was over. But it was the second trip to Vietnam when I went back, 1994. That surprised me very much. I really had issues with anger, survivor's guilt, and that was a tough trip. And often I would get in these silly arguments with Vietnamese over the goofiest things. I had sent a number of faxes to Bill Kimball, who was the president, founder of Vets with a Mission. He was in another city, and I was kind of leading a construction team. We communicated by fax in those days, no mobile phones. And at the end of the week, the hotel double charged me for the faxes. Now, I mean, we're talking about 25 or 50 cents here, per fax. And we're not talking like, $100. But what I was dealing with, that pushed me over the edge. And I got into this huge argument with the Vietnamese on the other side of the registration desk at the hotel. It got so heated that I started to climb up on the desk, and one of the other team members from the Vets with a Mission grabbed me by the back of the shirt and pulled me down. And I blurted out, I think I shot your father. I was so ticked off about that. That was a terrible thing to say. That was a terrible witness for Christ. But the survivor's guilt and the anger, the frustration I've been holding in for a long time, over 20 years, finally came out that day.
Every veteran has to deal with their Vietnam experience in their own way. Sometimes it comes out in anger. Sometimes it comes out in fear. But two things these vets have in common is that they've all been shaped by war and by God. That's why we name the film in this podcast By War and by God. Their faith has led them back to Vietnam, and in the process, they found some sort of healing. What brought about the change?
I can tell you how I changed and when I changed, but I can't tell you what causes that.
This is Steve Scott.
I think that's bigger than me, and I don't understand. I feel truly blessed for being called. And I've read all the biblical things that I can get my hands on, but mostly I remember reading somewhere that God calls everyone, but not many answer. For some reason, I was receptive. I answered.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the By War and by God podcast from Paladin Pictures. Just a reminder to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And please, did you hear that? I said please tell a friend about us. You can learn more about By War and by God at bywarandbygod.com. A reminder to use the coupon code PODCAST at bigheavencafe.com to save some cash on your copy of the film By War and by God. You can also watch the film for free if you have an Amazon Prime account. Find me on Facebook or Twitter. Just search for Kent C. Williamson, and while you're there, search for By War and by God and like or follow us. Please email your thoughts about the show to kent@bywarandbygod.com. The film will be at the Bare Bones International Film and Music Festival in Muskogee, Oklahoma on Saturday, April 22nd, where it will screen at the historic Roxy Theater. By War and by God will also screen on Friday, May 5th at the International Christian Film Festival in Orlando, so check it out if you can. The By War and by God podcast is written and produced by me, Kent C. Williamson, with sound design and finishing by Ashby Ratchford. Our audio engineer in the studio is Steve Carpenter. Thanks also to my brother Brad Williamson, who helped record the interviews in today's episode. The By War and by God soundtrack was composed by Will Musser, and for a limited time you can download the soundtrack for free at bywarandbygod.com. Thank you to the entire Paladin team, which includes Leslie Wood, Steve Carpenter, Dan Fellows, Steve Lessick, and Ashby Ratchford. This podcast is a production of Paladin Pictures. Yep, Paladin is a film production company that sees the value in audio podcasts. Why? because like is the case with By War and By God, the podcast can go deeper into the story than the film ever can. Paladin Pictures is committed to the creation of redemptive entertainment and thought-provoking cultural critique. Learn more about us and our films at paladinpictures.com. That's Paladin, Paladin, pictures.com. By War and By God is produced at the Paladin Studio in the amazingly wonderful, beautiful little town of Charlottesville, Virginia. And of course, thank you to our veterans, those who returned, and especially those who didn't, like my wife's Uncle Floyd. Thank you. Next week on the By War and By God podcast.
She gathered up all of the polio orphans off of the streets and did her best to care for them.
A lot of these veterans went home believing they had destroyed a country, believed they had destroyed a people. There was one individual on our trip who had not had a night's sleep in 30 years since he left the war.
Vets with a Mission has had some great days in Vietnam, and we've had some bad days.